Ebuzami Mwakabadi DH Politics Avenue. Make sure also subscribe to our channel. And please again leave a nice comment and make sure to share the video to other viewers. Ebuzami Mayimbo Ryan Semnimo. Eye Brian a champon. Yeni na yeni mse oka MPP flag bearership race in the one ene wa expose a former CEO of Cocoabod or Bonisobo say he should keep quiet now. Yen na CEO Cocoabod. Meanwhile, many women say and no be bring a course of Cocoabod entry ya. Nanso Eye Brian a champon I expose in ya ene Eye Cocoabod CEO ni hu aka edwemu dindindin ya iyokofo ebetutu na no ebisane enoma ekoso ewo Cocoabod a entry CID MPP for na nkasa expose omo ho enoma bebre omo ye ya ankoye waiting in yato na we yateneto ena ene edu Cocoabod CEO eso mama yimbo wa yensem ni mu na yenkohwe ensem a ekoso
etina jese omampani otisu nei senisu ene ne ban ya se Kwame Nkrumah de a ene omu nyina no wo share the same day ye de wo mo eti omu nyina Kwame fo okira so ya Saturday eti ene ze we kra de ze ka kwa chirisa etenra His Excellency Akroma, the President of the Republic or US abrochimemu na wone empanifo din komo and watch a kwanya esese the Western world edi Africa for faso watch say if the UN ehase na 80 years ago na a membership over Africa ama hodo makomako enan ededi kan edom ye but enei oba ye membership no a grow papa na UN kra membership no say 80 years ago ode toto ene membership state no eho a na chese mo makomako enan what yase etino womne ye bi omoye no womo ya obon consider say Africa hanom no yensoso esia no ye jena so ye papa nya sam ketwa waka kirem say by 2050 wo hwe ewiase population a esemada be more than 25% do na be free Africa ha ebio eba no youth population a ewiase nyina da wo chemu miensa Africa beje baako na tu na aka no ye fa ne say Western world no any Asia for no ho no omo so eden akwa chichim eti ohwa na ye ka dache pad ma wiase a dache no any Africa abibrem what a speech eti ye bedwudwom sani okeka no nyina no ye be translation nyina ma na yakeka nsem no atiase na fe ho awane ma esifa ebeko no the fight against galamsey enso so egusu a ye ka ho nsem se yanhwe ya dache bi no na ye ton ye kitasika so de nyansuo nom ze osu pesika na mu yenkotogo enkoto nsuo ma nom de na kire sebi ye yadane sebi kwase bi ana all bible mu a odidi me ya oseme kra mo ni nye na nyankopɔ ka se kwase a jeze ofeze wa no wa maju kra furu nsem no ahwe na o my Ghana yenso susubana kwa sebi kwase bi ana all bible mu a nyankopɔ je ne kra efi ne nsem no etie be hwe na the fight against galamsey owura ama kofibu a waka kirem se enei fiti sabre koyi yen water bodies no ene yakwa abretuo no eye security zone ye nyina ho nche 30 seconds going to be kra nyini what ya say ehwo na security zone yen fa okra ofa ho na twetwetwirawa ene na eye enye obi na kumantwi abega be se antwira na ku ne ho abega se enye obi na kumantwi antwira na why dey woku no enti na jese nia anenso so akro no enti abehwe na fei issues awdo yetimi edi nkomo na the acting president of the republic Professor Nana Jenopoko Ajiman wono so gusu bona djuma den anya sabgeto gusu akwa probo oguso educational eba say computer placement abaya ebirum de anyo ne se omo school ma ne beko no ma yama me aka se government appointees money awofo no kasa sabi mufo buo entare ho na mo solve say oyamunti na mo so me den mo honom ye behwe na issues awdo a ene so ha computer school or the microphone be so ebi so boa so na de ade nyina no sa issues ni ya beti ne te e hanom na face yatimi akọ enkakra kama na bia so atimi awie pen sam no de edoso papa pa enya asem ketwa na entokobia pai e MPP mu na pound for pound Dr. Bernard Champon one former Cocoabod CEO eye owura Joseph Boahin Edu na Bernard Champon akacha ne say we know what you did to Cocoabod. Na se no kind of brofo no as a Cocoabod no o nipa ogina ho. Na o say we will come there. Me kotu no me nyibi frim. Was we know what you did to Cocoabod. We will come there. Etuwe tokwa apie mo MPP mu a enya semketwa. Dr. Bernard Champon versus Joseph Boahin Edu pound for pound. Ni nyina MPP promise. And I'm start here. Hoto. So on munim akwanya. Cocoabod, former chief executive,
which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, we seek to be friends with all and enemies to none. The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you will find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Wassan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell its slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property, in quotes, and that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her briefing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana.
The Assembly.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and
Ebusiamina was a Bre or your channel GH Politics Avenue. So na meaning say ye beshia yeda masi bebre wo mbre ne madaja mo say my na ye shian so ane de insama e shama e twebu wo men kwa na ebesomo ebusiamina masi bebre erade nkamo ye besan so ehia